Hi, I'm Tom Hendrickson from the DevOps Online Summit, and welcome to our keynote interview with Shaaron Alvares. Shaaron, introduce yourself to the people here at the DevOps Online Summit.
Hey, hi, Tom. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here for the second year. Thank you so much, Tom, for having me. So Shaaron Alvares, I've been working in the Agile and DevOps transformation space for nearly 10 years now. I work in large organizations such as Amazon, Microsoft, T-Mobile, Expedia, and now Disney in Seattle, Washington. So I specialize in introducing lean practices, lean Agile and DevOps practices at scale. And I've been focusing also a lot on focusing on the DevOps culture, actually DevOps and Agile culture, because I think it's a huge challenge in organizations.
Yeah, the culture is so important, isn't it?
It is. It's very important, yes, and often neglected.
Mm-hmm. So your title for your session is Culture as a Product and Enabling a DevOps Culture. So Shaaron, tell us what you mean by that.
Yeah, so a lot of organizations invest enormous dollars, and I think in 2018 or 19, I read that organization invested almost $3 billion in tooling, and very few executives were actually satisfied with the results. And I have those numbers. And what happened is often we invest in the DevOps tools and technology, but not enough in the culture, in the people and the processes. And therefore, a lot of those DevOps transformations fail. And I think Gartner mentioned that by 2022, almost 75% of organizations will fail.
Wow, that's amazing. That's a big number that you quoted there, that 3 billion. So it's scary.
It is.
So what do you mean by a culture as a product?
So I think there are ways where that allows us to actually address this challenge. There are several ways we can look at in order to ensure that we are actually not just investing in the tools, but we are also investing in the people and the culture. And one methodology or framework I've been introducing is looking at culture as products. So some of the challenges we see, and the reason why we don't address it, we just focus on the technology. There's a lot of cultural challenges. So the DevOps mindset is at odds with company's culture. We know that it's also at odds with HR practices, the way we manage our people and the way we reward the performance, right? Mm-hmm. And we have a lot of silos and misalignment. And when we implement tools, we don't always address those silos and misalignment. And I think it's important to focus on the processes and the people. You know, how can we ensure that people are working collaboratively? And the DevOps, there's also a disconnect between leadership and team culture. So what leadership wants and what's important for the team culture in order to be effective. And I think the most critical challenge is that culture is not prioritized. And in fact, there's a quote that's interesting from John Willis. He said, and it was actually in 2010, which is a really long time ago, right? If you do not have a culture to support your DevOps adoption, all automation attempts will be fruitless. And Today, not much has changed. So in order to address this challenge, you asked me, what can we do? So some suggestion I had is treat the culture as a product. And the first thing to do is to prioritize it. So identify the different traits that you want your culture to have. Describe it, define it, put it in a backlog, and prioritize it and work on it.
That's kind of a really ingenious idea, Shaaron. I think that you kind of flipping it, because a lot of people think about they're separate, and you're kind of saying, okay, let's make it and put it, like you said, put it on our backlog. That's ingenious, I think.
Exactly. That's the purpose, actually. And, when you think about it, our teams perform sprint retrospectives, right? You probably facilitated and attended sprint retrospectives. And in order for those retrospectives to be effective, when we look at continuous improvement, one thing that the Scrum Masters or Agile coaches do, they actually ask them to identify 1 to 2 improvements that they want to run during the next sprint. And what we do generally, in order to make sure that we're working on those improvements, we put them in the backlog, in the next sprint backlog. And when we do stand up, we review those, right? We say, okay, how are improvements going? Whether it's an automation aspect we're looking at, whether it's the process, whether collaboration. So we put it in a backlog, and we have someone on the team that's volunteered to actually lead this improvement along with the team. And it's the same principle when we look at improving our automation and collaboration and culture, DevOps culture across an organization. It's exactly the same principle. We identify what are the improvements that we want to make. Where are we today in terms of culture? What are the pain points? What are the, how are we doing in terms of psychological safety? How can we ensure that we are working on psychological safety? And one of the best ways is simply to prioritize it and put it in an organizational backlog.
Yeah, that's very good. That's very good. How would you, Shaaron, describe the DevOps culture that you talk about?
Yeah, so a DevOps culture is a really good question. I wrote an article for the DevOps Institute about that, actually accelerating your DevOps culture and what are the traits of a DevOps culture. So there's a lot of different features and capability. I like to call them features of capability, and that ties back in my idea of considering your culture as a project. So some of those traits and features of team autonomy and empowerment. We want to focus also on continuous improvement. So if we can foster within your organization a culture where teams are empowered and autonomous, where they address continuous improvement and throughout their sprint on a monthly cadence or quarterly cadence, but also a sprint cadence. A culture where the customers or your business stakeholders and product managers are extensively involved in a conversation with technology. So the customer involvement and engagement is also one aspect. And then diversity inclusion. It's really important to look at how we can get better at including our diverse workforce, right? It's not we talk about that a lot. It's not just hiring a diverse team. It's also ensuring that they have a voice, that they are fully included in the team. So looking at that as well, it's really important in fostering collaborative DevOps culture. And then there's also at the leadership level, looking at Western leadership, transformational leadership aspects and traits. So Western has identified, pathological, bureaucratic, and generative cultures. And DevOps culture align extremely well with generative leadership and culture. So what are those traits and how can we get there? So where are we in the Western organizational leadership? And how can we get better? How can we get from pathological to bureaucratic or bureaucratic to generative, actually? And few other aspects I want to touch on is conversation, what I call the 3 C's: conversation, collaboration, and cooperation. And 2 additional, actually, experimentation, continuous experimentation, and psychological safety. Well, I gave you a list, of traits, behaviors, features of a DevOps, ideal DevOps culture. I don't think that all organizations can focus on all of those, right? But I think one way we can look at it is run assessments, understand where we are, what are the challenges within our own organization through assessment, and then develop a roadmap, identify what are those great features that we want to focus on, and develop a roadmap to get there.
So, Shaaron, you shared a lot there. Is there a hierarchy to these items that you kind of detailed in your culture? Because I think about, for instance, I'm taking notes here and I'm thinking, okay, if I want to take this to my organization, is there some place that I should start? Because you mentioned like the assessment, but is there certain things maybe I want to focus on first?
So, that's the thing. I think it has to be customized. I'm not a big fan of assessments. Nicole Forsgren, who wrote Accelerate, it's a very popular book. I did an interview of Nicole Forsgren, and she said something really important. She also doesn't believe in assessments because they are generally too vanilla. We're doing an assessment. The questions are not adequate, are not customized to organizations or team. And she believes more in constraint assessment, but based on constraints-based assessment. And I completely agree. So that's the reason why my recommendation and the way I do it, and when I do, for example, team assessment or DevOps assessment, I start with the team. So know where your organization are, and to do that, it has to be customized. So the questions have to be customized. The questions have to be written collaboratively, engaging people across the organization and across all of the levels. And we can do an assessment, and if we follow those patterns, we can do an assessment that will really drive accurate information about where we are. If we take an assessment that's completely vanilla, out of the shelf, I don't think that the questions are going to be accurate enough to help understand the real state of an organization. So, and based on this customized assessment, constraints-based assessment, we can actually identify the gaps, the critical gaps that are impeding delivery, that are impeding flow, that are impeding collaboration, and all of the aspects that I talked about an ideal DevOps culture. And then we can prioritize those, right? For example, psychological safety is oftentimes a really, really important one, and it's not very well understood. Very few executives actually understand the importance of psychological on DevOps teams effectiveness. So another one is autonomy and empowerment. So I think you're right. I don't think there's a hierarchy. I think what's important is starting from the organization, where they are, what are their priorities, and what is also their organizational culture. We want that assessment and what we're trying to do to also align fairly well with the organizational culture. And I'm not talking about the DevOps culture, but the people culture, strategic culture, and so on. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that's a very good answer.
Thank you.
So what are some of the benefits of approaching things in this way, Shaaron?
So yeah, that's a really good question. I think it allows us to actually be more successful and get the buy-in of our people. When we actually develop a plan, when we know that a DevOps culture is prioritized and it gets the sponsorship and the visibility from leadership, it really helps the DevOps team to see that we are working towards fostering the environment that they need to be effective, right? So we get their buy-in, we get a higher engagement, work satisfaction, and all of those items that we prioritize, they are worked on by the DevOps team and the management, right? So it creates a greater collaboration between the different levels within an organization as well, greater alignment, understanding between executive, leadership, directors, management, and the teams. So, and it also contributes to sustaining it, because sometimes we have cultural initiatives, they last for a few months and then they are completely dropped out. They are completely dropped and people don't continue these efforts. But if we take time to prioritize it, put it in a backlog and make sure it's part of our delivery, we keep working on it, and it's the best way to sustain the effort.
So you bring up a good point there, Shaaron. I want to touch on that. If an organization, embraces this DevOps culture, but then maybe some things happen where maybe there's some leadership change, or maybe you had a DevOps coach, for instance, and that person left, and some of this stuff might lie dormant. What are some ways, people who work in those organizations can kind of reinvigorate that drive for sustaining a good DevOps culture?
Yeah, that's a good question too. So one of the best ways, and it's interesting because Nicole Forsgren as well talked about that. So I did an interview of her last year about her book Accelerate and the state of DevOps in 2020 actually. And we talked about a lot of cultural aspects. So it was published by InfoQ, so you can easily find the article. But one thing she mentioned is because organizations are going through a lot of changes, just like you said, Tom, people leaving, leadership leaving, executives leaving, CIO leaving. It's important to create a mechanism and channels and mechanism to allow people to actually keep doing the work they're doing. And some of those mechanisms, the best way is the community of practices. And they generally long live center of excellences, because center of excellences are led by PMOs, project management offices, but community of practices are actually led by people. And so they are more resilient because they are not impacted by reorg. They are not impacted by people leaving because they are owned by individual contributors or even managers that are contributing. And so when we launch an initiative around DevOps culture, it's also really important to bake that into the different community of practice that we have. And in fact, when I say put all of your cultural initiative in a backlog, that can be also addressed, that can be worked on by community of practices. And that's a really good way to make sure that the DevOps teams are involved, are engaged, and also this initiative is resilient, and it's actually defeat all of the reorg that may happen in an organization.
Shaaron, you've shared a lot with us today. Any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I think my closing thought is there are many ways we can prioritize DevOps culture. And I want to give an example. For example, at the Disney, there's a Jason Cox is director platform, and he regularly encourages teams to talk to him, to engage among each other on ways they can improve the way they're working. And he sends emails where he reminds everybody how important to work on continuous improvement, for example. So that's one example. So there are many ways we can actually foster a greater DevOps culture. It's absolutely critical. DevOps tooling, automation is still going to fail if we don't address the people, process, and culture aspect. So it's really find ways to prioritize it. And you can refer to a presentation that I did at the Software Delivery Leadership Forum with CloudBees, and I think the video is posted, so I highly encourage you to watch it, because there's a panel conversation with different contributors who will also share ways that we can enable a DevOps culture. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thanks for coming on, Shaaron.
Thank you.
On behalf of Shaaron Alvares, I am Tom Hendrickson for the DevOps Online Summit.